All right. So we have about half an hour-ish to 40 minutes of sort of this talk, of this story, and then, as Marco said, we'll go through Q&A. I'm actually super excited to see what kind of questions and concerns and ideas all of you have, and what I can also personally take away from this. So I'm actually really looking forward to the Q&A. So the agenda is sort of the official story is like, we want you to learn about how a Twitter University helps engineers get up to speed faster through peer learning. But in reality, what this is really about is how are we able to do about 100 classes per month, about 3,000 registrations, 6,000 hours of learning every month at relatively high 70 MPS with a small team of 2 professional instructors and 2 program managers. So that's the sort of overall agenda of this presentation. So just a little bit about me. Mark already mentioned. Prior to joining him, I did a lot of engineering work, R&D, as both a software engineer and in sort of leadership space. We then started Morocana, the open source training company. We did that for about 8 years. We both got acquired. The company got acquired to join Twitter and start Twitter University. I have since sort of grown to also manage other concerns within Twitter, things that are sort of adjacent to Twitter University and some that are a little bit more distant, like technical documentation, open source, and CI/CD and performance tooling and so forth. But Twitter University is the thing that I started with, is the thing that I'm, to be honest, most passionate about. And I've been doing that for about 7 years. So what is Twitter University? Just to give you sort of a high-level overview, we are a team focused or dedicated to helping engineers at Twitter get up to speed faster. We do serve a non-engineering population as well, but we focus on technical skills. We think of getting up to speed not just as an NHO or onboarding exercise. We think of it as an ongoing concern. People are constantly getting up to speed across many different sort of technologies, processes, workflows that exist and evolve at Twitter. So it's a sort of a never-ending process. We're situated within the engineering org, which is a little bit confusing given that our name would imply a much broader scope. There are other learning and development organizations within Twitter. One, for example, in HR that focuses mostly on soft skills. And we do partner with them, but our goal is specifically to serve the engineering audience. We're primarily focused on at Twitter type sort of questions and learnings. And what I mean by that is, as you will see, we are less, we sort of spend a lot less energy teaching folks on what we refer to as commodity topics, like intro to a programming language, intro to a framework, something that we used to do a lot before. We're more concerned about things like how do we do machine learning at Twitter? How do we do data science at Twitter? How do we do experimentation at Twitter? How do we develop mobile applications or services at Twitter? So it's the at Twitter bit where we feel like we are able to add the most value. So what do we offer? I kind of went over some of these stats. We have about up to 100 classes per month, about up to 3,000 registrations per month. About 6,000 student hours, which is one of the leading metrics we use to measure ourselves. At 70 MPS, our actual promise to our sort of stakeholders is 60, but 70 is the internal sort of threshold we aim for. We also have a library of videos and other kind of content, including some that is suitable for self-paced learning. And we also support mentorship programs. Although this particular talk is less about the second two and more about the sort of in live instructor-led peer learning and how we do that. In terms of who we are currently 2 program managers. Up for a long time, it was only 1, so we've grown, doubled. We have 2 professional instructors who, as I'll explain, sort of their scope is much broader than just instruction. I would actually say coaching is a much more important aspect of what they do. We have half a software engineer and a half an engineering manager. So the software engineer and the engineering manager are shared with a Tradeoffs team, which we consider to be a sister team of Twitter University, because after all, we are kind of after the same goal, but through different mediums. But what's most interesting, and this is what I'll zero in on, is that we have about 200 plus engineers who teach. This is, over time, has ranged from 10 to 20% of our engineering workforce. And that's what we really mean by peer learning. So in terms of the definition, like if you kind of look it up on Wikipedia, I'm sure some of you have, there's sort of two ways of thinking about it. One is this cooperative learning, where it's about folks within a classroom helping each other learn. And I think it's a really good way to sort of drive engagement. As a pedagogical tool, it's something that we do employ and leverage at Twitter. But for the purposes of this talk, what we mean by peer learning is more the latter. This is learning for everyone, by everyone, about almost anything. So it's more about, learning across time and space and distributed throughout the organization. We obviously also, in this particular case, imply instructor-led for the most part, although there are sort of other forms of peer learning that are not instructor-led. And we mostly focus it on engineering skills as opposed to literally anything. Some people do refer to this as peer-to-peer learning as opposed to just peer learning. Now, in terms of where it comes from and how it's been sort of like how the industry has been reacting to this, like the concept of peer learning dates back to the beginning of last century, like where people have been thinking about different ways of learning. So this is not new. We did not invent anything. And if I just take a look at Google Trends, you will see that it's been kind of up and down, but at the same time mostly flat over at least the last 5-ish years. But what we are noticing is that folks in our peer companies, folks in at least in the technical space, have been applying similar sort of approaches to driving their technical learning. Airbnb has talked about their data university. Netflix has been doing this. Google is known to have done this for ages. Yahoo was actually probably one of the pioneers in our industry, and then obviously we've been doing it for the past 7 years. There's a lot more logos that I could have put here, but like this is just to say that it's a concept that exists. It's not new, but at the same time, it's not necessarily as visible as I think it should be. So to kind of give you a little bit of a story how we got there, let me kind of go back to the beginning of Twitter University. When we came to Twitter, we were initially asked to help drive specific technical competency in what I now refer to as commodity learning around Android, around Scala, around Python. Things that we used to be really good at as vendors of learning prior to joining Twitter. That was our core competency. And we really, I think, did a good job scaling that through vast swaths of folks across the industry. But what we really realized very quickly is that the need that existed at Twitter and exists to this day was less about an individual commodity skill, but more about the application of that skill to how we use it at Twitter. So for example, it's less about Android, it's more about how we build mobile applications at Twitter. It's less about Scala, it's more about how we do service development on Twitter. It's less about Python, it's more about how we do data science with Python at Twitter, or experimentation, or machine learning, and so forth and so forth. It's that at Twitter bit that we realized was what people were craving for, because Twitter, like this is probably true for all of the organizations represented here, has had to sort of solve problems in unique ways that model our unique scale and unique sort of problem space. And so we can't just bring people from the outside and sort of expect them to apply what they knew and effectively right away. Like we needed to really help them understand how Twitter solves these problems in a Twitter unique way. So what we realized is that we, were being asked to do something that was definitely outside of our comfort zone. We were not subject matter experts on all these things. And the question was, should we be? Like, is that even possible? Especially because the technology evolves very rapidly. Are we able to sort of tool ourselves up on this? And by the time we do, has the world shifted? What was interesting is that when we joined, there was already a small contingent on volunteer instructors, our volunteer engineers, who were helping drive engineering onboarding, which we call engineering flight school. And what that showed us was that there were folks in the engineering circles who were actually already passionate about learning and teaching. And they were already putting their considerable time and effort towards helping spread that knowledge, helping welcome new folks. Obviously, the program could have been improved, and we certainly did. But what this showed us as a proof of concept is that the potential to tap into the existing subject matter expertise was already there. And that's when we thought, like, okay, well, really what we are experts on ourselves, our team, is on knowledge sharing. How do we amplify that through others? How do we tap into that expertise? So, whoops, sorry. So we realized that, you know, our kind of epiphany was that we needed to shift from being the teachers in teaching to being the folks who facilitate knowledge sharing. At the on Twitter specific topics, at the scale of our company and the scale of our engineering, which was growing rapidly, at a pace of the change, which is probably true for our entire industry, but certainly true for Twitter, where we're constantly sort of evolving how we do things, and with extremely limited staffing. So our goal was, let's tap into that expertise. Let's tap into the time and the goodwill that engineers at Twitter have already shown us. So what were some of our early observations? People at Twitter are already, and I would actually argue people in engineering especially, and probably in other professions as well, are already intrinsically motivated to teach and share what they know. It's certainly part of our culture, and I've experienced it and seen it elsewhere, even prior to coming to Twitter. A lot of them really need minimal nudging, minimal recognition. They sort of, the motivation comes from them wanting to meet people, them wanting to sort of explore the space, force themselves to learn something and become an expert by teaching it to others. But one thing that was very obvious is that they did not want to put up with friction. Like the proposition that we were selling to them is that you just show up and teach. We'll take care of everything else for you. And our goal of our team was to really focus on making sure that they can cause an impact, that they're visible for what they do, and then they get coached through feedback loops from the very early stages all the way to how their content and sort of instruction evolves over time. So we also realized that spreadsheets and duct tape don't scale. They don't work. The engineering flight school program that was already in place, that was based on essentially spreadsheets and calendar, was okay, but not consistent. A lot of sort of issues would show up where where a room got declined, or people got scheduled for a wrong time, or people didn't really know where to go and what was expected of them. So there were a lot of failures. A lot of sort of our time was spent just supporting this fairly inefficiently run sort of infrastructure. And what's worse is that these failures are very public. With learning, and especially instructor-led learning, people don't want to show up in front of a classroom full of confused students because they were sent to the wrong thing, or be in the middle of teaching and having someone knock on their door to tell them that their classroom, that the room was actually already reserved for something else. They just wanted to teach and not be bothered with everything else. And if things got in the way of that, that was demotivating them from showing up in the future. We also realized that we really needed to focus on gradually onboarding more and more people onto this. So we couldn't just wish everyone to be good at this. This is something that we needed to be intentional about. So we identified some key ingredients to what we think made us work. One was we needed to really come up with best practices for knowledge sharing in this model. This wasn't just going to happen on its own. We needed to be really intentional and explicit about these. Then we needed a way to encode these best practices in a platform that can help provide that consistency, provide avoid those failures that I mentioned before, but more importantly, automate a lot of repetitive things such that our team can spend our time on coaching, support, and recognition. We wanted to be, very specific around where we can drive value and sort of leverage, machines and computer everywhere else. So let's talk a little bit about best practices. Our main objective was to drive knowledge transfer and retention. The reason why this is important is because we recognized early on that a lot of people that are new to teaching tend to just default to lecturing because that's where they feel in control. That's where they feel comfortable. And for them to sort of open themselves up to sort of driving engagement, being accountable to knowledge transfer, that was actually asking them to go a little bit beyond what they were comfortable with. And so we needed to really support them there. One way we did this is we identified sort of these patterns of classes or course types, as we call them, and being explicit about what each course was meant to convey and what the objectives were. So we had these overview level courses, a taste of courses, essentials level courses, at Twitter specific courses, sort of internals of a particular system courses, or like very advanced topics. And even though one of these is called at Twitter, all of these were really contextualized to Twitter. So as an example, when a couple of years ago, we wanted the entire company to learn more about machine learning and how we apply it, it wasn't just a generic machine learning overview that we could have plucked from an online resource or a book or something. We developed this and contextualized it to Twitter so people would understand right from the get-go, right from the very early overview level courses, why was this important to them? Why was this important to our company? How do we apply it? How was this important to the industry? Where are we going with this? We also came up with a process that we use for launching new sort of courses and new initiatives. We always start with meta-analysis. We then think about what does that map to in terms of the course type. We then come up with a syllabus. And at that point, we actually may even test the demand for that syllabus before any line of actual content is written. We then go through a number of stages of drafts and canary and alpha beta testing before we finally launch it and then reiterate. This process of canarying is actually one that was sort of new to me because prior to this, we were always very much focused on impressing people right from the get-go. Having something that is sort of polished right from the get-go. But we realized that wasn't going to work. Like we needed to actually start in a very sort of scrappy way at a very canary stage, get validation that the learning was hitting the objectives of the audience, and only then continue to invest in further developing the content. So other best practices is that we really needed to keep things short and modular. Before, we used to teach day or week-long classes because that's what people were buying from us. Now at Twitter, we wanted to actually shift to an hour to 2 hour long modules or classes that we could then weave into a bigger story or set of stories. That made it very much easier for these things to be developed. It made it easier for people to learn over time, made it easier for people to teach because it was a lot less demanding of their time. It was easier to incorporate into everyone's calendar and sort of not be seen as this expensive sort of outlay of their time and energy. We also realized that we needed to contextualize it to Twitter. I already mentioned this a couple of times, but it's really about tribal knowledge that it exists around the company, capturing that and bringing that to sort of people's understanding. They needed to really think, like, how does this matter to me in the context of my job? We also amplified stories. We asked our folks, these 200 plus engineers, to bring themselves into these classes, to really talk about from personal experience, how we, for example, got to invent a particular technology or a particular workflow, what sucked in the past and why we think this is the right way, or even what sucks today and how it may be failing today and what's gonna replace it in the future. We also identified the need to develop these larger arcs, larger stories, so that things fit into a flow over time. So for example, when we launched a course around developing services and we broke it up into a bunch of smaller sort of courses, we needed to help engineers understand how these things, like how a full course that explores our data center and low-level server primitives maps to a course that talks about how you productionize a service and sort of maintain it in production. Like those two things needed to fit into something that seemed plausible, something that wasn't sort of a bunch of hello worlds strung together, but something that actually had a story where people could actually engage with that story and see the arc of that story over time. Another best practice is to continuously motivate learning. We realize that we can't just be dumping information on people. We can't assume that they care about everything. we have to sort of be driving things through this problem solution approach, where we motivate a problem, how to solve, for example, deploying something at scale, to exploring how the industry does it, to trying to understand how and if this would work in Twitter, and then exploring how we actually do it, and then eventually arriving to the practice that we use at Twitter. And so we think that that leads to better retention. I'm not going to necessarily go into why hands-on matters. I hope all of you understand why that leads to better retention. But our last learning is that we really needed to focus on lowering the cost of development and maintenance. I will come to this point over and over again, because with peer learning, we feel that this is a way to really optimize that sort of line between investment and impact. So the next key ingredient is having a platform for learning. I already mentioned that a little bit before. Whoops, I think I skipped a slide. Because we really needed a place where we could encode these best practices. So we called it GoLearn. We have these Go links like shorteners, like probably a lot of companies do. So we call things by shorteners. So this is a homegrown solution. It's a Ruby on Rails based web application that offers things like course cataloging and artifact management and storage, complex event and classroom scheduling, with all of the sort of like across time zones, across different time slots, across different offices, and so forth. A fairly robust sign up, waitlist, request, subscription workflows. So we're able to sort of help automatically detect when things fill up. We're able to sort of put people on waitlist. We're able to automatically promote them off of waitlist, add them back into schedule and so forth. So all of that is automated. And this, I think, key ingredient is calendar integration. We feel that it's important to bring the sort of the experience of learning right to where you are. A lot of systems that we've seen even used at Twitter don't have a robust mechanism sort of managing calendars, and it just becomes a thing that's out there that you have to keep mental cycles tracking, and you're likely to not show up, or other kind of issues are going to come up. We also have features around like automatic reminders, automatic feedback collection and reporting, capability for video storage, playback and tracking, learning path management, so like to capture sort of learning over an arc of time, pro tips for micro-learning that can be embedded in other systems, a discovery portal with search, so people can discover what's available and sort of slice it by different dimensions. Compliance management. For most of our training is not focused on compliance, but recently there were some issues or some topics that needed to that we needed to drive compliance around. So we built that capability. A fairly robust reporting and analytics. This allows us to be very data driven, and not only looking at the past, but also looking at the future, like where is demand, what people are asking for, and what's their availability of sort of supply or instructors in that space. And then delegated administration, which is like a way for us to help others and subject matter experts like manage their own sort of learning experiences for their audiences. And then Twitter look and feel. We felt that this needed to feel Twittery, or otherwise people were not going to use it. They were not going to engage with it. And the last ingredient is sort of coaching and support. So we felt like our value add was to help build those larger stories, those larger arcs of learning I keep on mentioning, and to help others plug into that, because they may only have the time to worry about their sort of neck of the woods. Like say I'm a team that is in charge of observability at Twitter, and I only know how to sort of explain to folks how my observability stack works. But I don't want to do it in a completely novel way. Like I want to plug into an already present story around how we should be, productionizing, for example, data jobs at Twitter. And so then my observability sort of class makes a lot more sense in that larger context. We also wanted to make it really cheap for people to test new ideas. As I mentioned before, we would sometimes create courses that don't actually exist. We would publicize them, even schedule them before a single line or a single slide or a line of content was written, and then use that to gauge demand. And if we felt that the demand wasn't there, we would just kill it and sort of not move forward. And if it was, then we would work with them, because we would schedule far enough in advance, we would use this as a mechanism to sort of tell us that we should invest in working with this subject matter expert to sort of help them develop this content or let them do it themselves. We saw that our job was really to help identify and connect sort of the supply and demand, like supply being the subject matter experts and demand being where the company is going and where the gaps are. So as an example, our company recently moved to hybrid cloud, where like we have our own data centers, but we also leverage other people's sort of cloud solutions. So we needed to retool the company, all those engineers, on how to think about it and work in that kind of environment. So we were proactively looking for what is the kind of demand that will exist and how we best sort of support it. And then suppliers, like, well, who are the experts in that area? How do we work with them? How do we get them to sort of push for this? How do we not just wait for them to show up later and knock on our door, but how do we be proactive about it? And then the last bit is about sort of logistics and AV and other kinds of like issues that are inevitably going to come up. You know, we can only automate so much. There's going to be always, you know, one-off cases that we can't anticipate, and we need humans for that. Additionally, we do marketing of the content. So we have, you know, obviously the platform helps us with marketing. It's a portal of learning, but it also, we also do our own marketing through email or through these billboards, which are screens around the office that automatically pull down upcoming classes and show what's coming and who's taking it. So it drives sort of this social engagement. We do automatic quality control. Our system automatically notifies us when a class does poorly. So we go and follow up with folks if, you know, whether it's to update their content or update their approach to teaching. We have a whole sort of Go Teach program where we sort of schedule this like meetups with our instructors. We help think of onboarding themselves onto the idea of teaching and getting better at that skill and presenting. We reward them, we recognize them, we get our engineering leadership to come in and sort of recognize them explicitly. So it's an ongoing sort of program to make sure these people feel part of a sort of a teaching community. We also worked on adding teaching to career ladders so that people feel that they're being recognized officially during performance reviews and during promo sort of cycles. And then we continually optimize for getting management buy-in through our data, through our stories, through, again, having them come and sort of recognize all this work. So why peer learning? Sort of there's, you know, why don't we do a bunch of videos? Why don't we do a bunch of tutorials, code labs, content libraries? Why not e-learning? So these are some of the thinking that sort of, has gone into our decision to move this way. One is, we realize that, you know, the folks, the knowledge is decentralized. You know, it's all around the company and it's constantly changing and evolving. Because there's high rate of change, by the time any one of us were to go and write a tutorial or, you know, level ourselves up on this technology, it's likely going to shift. It's likely going to be, you know, already need to be updated. So we needed to tap into the expertise that was constantly evolving. We also needed to make it cheap to start. You can't, you know, before we would go and invest, you know, tens or hundreds of multiples of, you know, per hour of learning into developing their content, because we were going to amortize this cost across, you know, thousands and thousands of folks out there. But now at Twitter, you know, the audience is limited. We don't want to necessarily spend a ton of time developing content that will only be consumed by, say, a couple hundred people, and then slowly over time consumed by, you know, whatever, dozens of folks, say, per quarter or whatnot. So we needed to keep costs under control. But more importantly, we needed to keep the cost of maintenance under control. Because of that rate of change, the more something is encoded in a static medium like video, the harder it is to actually re-record it and make sure that it's telling the right story, the thing that we want people to learn. We wanted to make it optimal for customization. We needed to sort of really, and still need to, make sure that the content can be, you know, customized to the audience. So for example, if we're teaching machine learning to a group of engineers, we're going to teach it differently than if we're teaching it to a group of product managers. So that's the, you know, the human element that, if you will, that the instructor adds to the equation. We wanted to optimize for cultural immersion. This may seem like just a bullet point on the list, but I think it's super important because we noticed that some of our peers, you know, for for onboarding, they would just, welcome people to the company and point them to a bunch of videos and docs and give them a laptop and say, good luck. But we feel that misses the opportunity to really immerse people into the culture, to feel welcomed, to sort of, for them to see the colleagues that they're going to get to interact with. We really wanted to optimize for that kind of high touch experience. And then customer connection. What's interesting is we enable vendors, software vendors of internal tools and systems to connect to their customers through learning. Whereas before they might have done office hours and whatnot, or send a bunch of docs to their customers. Now they get a medium through which they're able to interact with them directly. And that's not only great for them to help teach their customers and own sort of how their customers use their products, but it's also a great feedback loop to them on how they can make their products be better. In fact, we've used this mechanism to eliminate teaching, whereas before, for example, we may have had like 2 days worth of content on a particular topic. We were able to reduce it to 2 hours because the folks who were building that sort of the technology were realizing from these classes the pain points of using their technology, and they figured out how to make it more ergonomic and easier to onboard with. Obviously, a large impact. We feel that as a small team, we've been able to have a large impact through this medium. So that's why we feel good about continuing to invest in that. We feel this medium is a great way to sort of foster cultural norms around knowledge sharing, but also other ways of company building. We want people to not just think of their job as the only thing to contribute to, but think about their peers, their organization. How can they be seen? How can they help others in a sort of much bigger, more cross-cutting way? We feel this sort of leads to faster turnaround time, like our time to sort of release a new piece of content or a new learning is, weeks, maybe months, not months or quarters or longer in case of some other kinds of mediums out there. And then it's also a great medium or great channel for leadership to reach the entire company. So like, for example, we recently needed to update some of our SDLC practices around thinking about privacy by design. We tapped into this medium to sort of both make the new processes feel more human, but also in order to scale and reach everyone throughout the organization, regardless of the kind of field they were in. And then finally, we also get videos as a side effect. That's not our primary objective, but often we have automatic video recording of live training sessions, and these videos go into our library. And if someone wanted to watch a video rather than attend a live course, that is always an option for them, or at least to go back and review something that might have been said. So what are some of the alternatives to peer learning? Well, obviously, there's self-paced learning. We talked about it: content libraries, docs, office hours, one-on-one mentorship, on-the-job learning, say through code reviews. And all of these are, by the way, really good mediums, especially the on-the-job learning. In fact, as we all know, probably 80% of learning happens that way. But there's this sort of rate of learning or not learning. So in some ways, what we compete with is people not learning fast enough. That's the thing that we want to sort of accelerate. So what are some of the trade-offs? Well, there's the trade-offs is around cost. I already mentioned that. There's a trade-off of quality or the level of polish, the maintainability of learning over time, as well, in particular in a fast-changing environment, the time to market, how long it takes us to go from like an ask or an idea to actually going out there and validating it and getting people to engage with it, time to competency for our engineers. As we all know, engineers are super expensive to recruit and then to sort of onboard. What if we shorten the time to their competency and actually in doing so justify our efforts and accelerate sort of or cast a wider net to our recruiting team, so they're able to not necessarily look for subject matter experts, but they're able to look for great engineers and trust that they have a team that can level up those engineers on Twitter specific sort of technology, so they're able to sort of move faster. And then type to adoption, like if a team, for example, is rolling out a new practice, say a new way of doing machine learning, how quickly will it take for the entire company to sort of adopt that? In the old world, I think through docs and through sort of emails and whatnot, things just drag on forever. And we think that through this medium, we're able to reach people faster. Culture immersion, I already talked about it. I think that's a huge trade-off between live learning versus non-live learning. scale, we'll talk about scale in a moment. I already talked about customization because we feel that we should be able to customize and sort of make the content and the sort of the experience of learning and the objective of learning on the fly be adapted to the skills and the needs of the audience. And then the customer empathy, like I already talked about that. I think that this is a medium through which a team can see and empathize about how their technology is consumed within the company. Siloing, we feel that not learning leads to a lot of siloing across the organization, which often leads to sort of politics and other sort of I'm not going to go into other things. Like I think in siloing is enough to sort of say that that's I think an anti-pattern for knowledge. Human flexibility. We think this is something that we need to optimize for because we want people to not just see themselves as, say, for example, a backend engineer, and if they need to do some analytics on the performance data, to have to depend on a data analytics team to help them with that. What if they were able to sort of acquire that skill cheaply and efficiently so they can do their own data analytics? Or what if an engineer wants to move from being an iOS engineer to being a backend engineer? How can they do that and stay within the company? Can we retain their domain expertise and shift them through different careers within the company through our branching efforts? And then obviously career growth and development, that hopefully goes without saying, which often leads to better retention and even helps with recruiting. And then diversity. Diversity is sort of, there's two ways to it. Like we explicitly use sort of diversity, or I should say, we explicitly get instructors that are in the underrepresented communities to sort of be out there in the front lines to sort of drive more visibility into sort of the diversity. But also we think of learning as a way of increasing the diversity of ideas and the spread of knowledge throughout the company. And question that comes up often is quality. Like, how the heck can we trust engineers who've never, say, taught a class to actually be any good at it? So we feel that perfect is the enemy of the good. We really don't need to over-optimize for quality, especially not early on. We explicitly want to start scrappy, test and validate, and then iterate until we find the sweet spot and avoid over-engineering, because things that are over-engineered tend to be hard to maintain. And I think our NPS of 70, which is, by the way, one of the many metrics we use to measure ourselves, but it's enough to tell us that so far this has not really been an issue for us. And then scale. How do we think about scale? How are we able to reach everyone? Obviously, a video can reach everyone overnight. But the challenge with thinking of that that way is that videos don't get consumed. Like there's no accountability to actually having people engage with the content and actually retaining the content. Our scale is in terms of number of instructors, number of students, number of different topics, and the rate of change, and the number of locations, and number of teams we have to serve. That's how we think about scale. One way or two ways we sort of help distribute that a little bit is through course maintainers, which is a mechanism by which we allow the subject matter experts to control sort of the scheduling and the learning experience of their own courses. And then university ambassadors, which are folks in other locations and other teams who help represent our team and sort of learning with those teams. So they kind of, they're kind of like a mini franchise of Twitter University, and they do that again on volunteering basis. This is not something that they're sort of explicitly being charged to do. So the biggest takeaways is, if I can just summarize everything, is that peer learning is really a great medium to scale the spread of the organizational know-how. We think that subject matter experts are already willing and able to teach. They don't require a lot of sort of nudging and recognition for them to and support to be good at it. Our primary goal should be to reduce friction and amplify their voices. And then we really benefit from having a platform that helps us automate and sort of encode best practices so that we and our team can spend our time sort of providing high-touch support. So with that, I want to thank you for your time, and I want to open it up to any questions you may all have.
Cool. Thank you, Saša. That was like action-packed, a lot of stuff. And I've been observing the chat in the meantime, so thank you all for all the questions on the side. I sort of like, if I had to kind of like map a couple of themes in the sidebar, there was a question of like, oh, this is all great. How do you convince management that this is a good thing to do? So that's kind of like theme one set of questions. How do you get a buy-in from leadership? The other one is, this is great, but how do you get engineers to be able to become instructors? They're engineers, right? Even if they're allowed, first of all, to have that freedom to teach from the leadership, how do you enable them to actually be good leaders? And is there like a feedback mechanism to tell you who's not good and who is, so that you can kind of do something about that, either a presenter or a course at large? Mm-hmm. And then there's a third sort of set of questions, which is more about logistics, about managing skills inventory and scheduling and review and so on. So maybe start with like, first of all, how do you sell this up?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so what's interesting is that question never occurred to us because there was already evidence of that happening organically. As I mentioned before, there was this sort of a band of folks who were helping run engineering flight school. And we just kept on going. We just never bothered asking for permission. We sort of said, look, this is the way to do it. Like, let's just reach out. People, and we don't have an official like 20% time like some organizations do where people can spend time on anything they want. But in general, in practice, it kind of works that way. There is now a more formal expectation that people engage in these kinds of company building sort of activities. And like, as I mentioned, this is now recognized on the career ladders. But when we started, that wasn't the case, yet in practice, it was already sort of, the culture was already predisposed to that. We literally just threw fuel on that fire. When we talk to managers, when we talk to leadership, and we sort of explain what we're doing, we never ask for permission. It's more of like, and we never even told them about our intention to do this. We just told them this is what's going on. We just invited like our head of engineering to come and thank the instructors for doing this on the side. Not as, and we never asked them like, do you approve of this kind of practice? Maybe this was naive. Maybe this is something that, we kind of got lucky, probably we did. But my hypothesis is this is more true across our industry than maybe people believe to be the case. And this is easy to pilot and test without having to sort of solicit broad approval. And then once it's demonstrated its value, I think maybe it's then okay to think about formally recognizing it. I hope that answered the question. The second question was, sorry, can you remind me?
It was how do you manage quality? Like, how do you get the instructors to be able to teach and feed?
Yeah, so I mean, there's so first of all, obviously, Twitter, I think, hires great engineers, a lot of whom come from sort of like with PhD backgrounds or come from like, maybe even academia where they might have done this kind of instruction or worked in this kind of capacity. So for those folks, it's relatively easy. It's, it's actually something that's forcing them to unlearn some of their practices is a bigger challenge where, like, for example, some of them may default to lecturing. For others, it's sort of, we have a program where they can come, observe a class, then help TA a class, then help deliver a particular module or existing class, then help develop a new module and sort of teach it from scratch, then have one of our instructors sit in, observe them teach, and then give them feedback and sort of work with them through their feedback from the audience and then iterate on that. Now, not everyone, not all of those 200 people require, 200 plus people require the level of support. It really depends. We often start with, let's assume they're good. Let's not force them to prove themselves that they're good. The worst that can happen is, yes, there will be an opportunity cost of people spending time sort of, not learning much. But that's why we actually label things as canaries. Is some people are okay, like they know that they're there to learn, but they also know that they're there to give feedback and be supportive of their colleagues. And so in practice, this has not really been an issue. Like rarely did we have like someone completely bomb a class where then, we needed to actually take some drastic measures to sort of like recover. In fact, I can't think of that ever happening. In fact, I can think of that happening before when we used to work with professional instructors, some of whom were subcontractors prior to Twitter. But at Twitter, this has not really ever been an issue. That's not to say that we don't run into quality issues. There's always sort of a long, like I told you, the NPS, it didn't go into like standard deviation, which I think is relatively low, but there's certainly low scores, and we do pay attention to those, and we do engage with the students, with the content, with the instructor to see how we can improve and iterate. And to be honest, it's not been an issue. Like that's been, like a lot of people assume that to be an issue. In practice, it's not proven to be the case.
Got it. And maybe one more question about there's something about career paths, and how does this integrate with the career paths, and like, how do you think in terms of longer arc of human development and not just like a micro learning experience?
Right. So I mean, first of all, I want to say like learning is, happens in many different mediums. I already mentioned, but most of the learning happens on the job, right? We think that this kind of learning is really great for helping people understand change, understand sort of like a path of the forest, like the golden path, and then give them sort of a mental map onto which they can kind of attach other kinds of learnings they're going to encounter on the job, right? So we don't force anyone to do any kind of learning. Learning itself is not something that we expect people to do as a way of growing their careers. People are measured by their impact and how they work on their team and across the organization. Like those are the sort of what we evaluate folks at Twitter on. So we think that learning is just like an enabler for them to get up to speed faster and sort of cause bigger impact. However, we do reward teaching. Like that falls into that how category. So it's not just like what you did, but how you went about doing your job. And these kind of company building activities like teaching is now in the ladder, like especially for senior staff and higher, like there's an expectation that you're out there teaching and enabling others, or somehow imparting your knowledge. It may for some people be more of a mentorship, or for docs or other forms of sort of sharing their wisdom. But for a lot of people, teaching is a medium that works well and helps them scale and reach others faster, and then be recognized in doing so in the process.